delay or whatever till it goes out there. So we are going live.
Live?
Yep.
So good evening.
Should be. Sorry, I'm muting.
Are we live?
Yep.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the first meeting in 2021 of BayLISA, the Bay Area Large Installation Systems Administration User Group. My name is Mark Rovner. I'm the current president of BayLISA, and today we also have here fellow BayLISA board members Guy Purcell, Rob Markovic, and Peter Downs. Hope everyone is having a great start to the new year. It's been
unmuted
first few weeks, but here's hoping 2021 turns out better than the last one. We're still doing the whole social distancing thing, so BayLISA board will continue to work to hold these virtual BayLISA meetings. BayLISA is held on the third Thursday of every month and open to the public. We hope you'll stick with us through this virtual format until such time that in-person events are possible again. BayLISA is a membership organization, and we do encourage people to join, but it's not required. Membership fees enable us to pay for various organizational expenses like website and meetup.com fees, so that we can bring you speakers on relevant and interesting topics. To continue these events, we really need people to step up and become members, though. BayLISA can only continue like it does with the financial support of members. Individual membership is $45 a year, and corporate membership is $2,500 a year. If you or your organization would like to become a member, please contact myself or one of the board members, either in chat or in email or on the meetup.com site. We usually thank our hosts for allowing us to use their facilities, but for now, we thank each of you for taking time to bring us into your lives and your homes and join us. While we can't provide food and drink in this format, we can collectively partake in individual refreshments while listening together. So if you don't have something, that'd be a good time to run off to the pantry and find something. Read the email that went out with the link to the meeting. With the new video conferencing option, there are a few new rules. Quick summary is to please keep your audio muted. Feel free to ask questions in chat, which we will present to the speaker at appropriate moments. And please be curious and professional in any voice or chats, as everybody can hear you now. Finally, note that we are recording this audio and video, and we'll make it available for later viewing. BayLISA is a volunteer organization too, and as such, the board is always looking for volunteers. If you enjoy these talks, we encourage you to give back to the community and help. It's not hard work, but shared work is always easier. The board itself meets the first Tuesday of the month, currently also via video chat, to plan for future meetings and other ways to make BayLISA better. As important is finding speakers, so even if you don't have time to volunteer, but you have a topic or a speaker you'd like to hear, or even you have something you'd like to present at a BayLISA meeting, please contact us and we'll follow up. Again, you can contact myself or one of the board members, chat here or email or through the meetup.com site. We typically talk about some upcoming tech events there. At least for the foreseeable future, many upcoming Usenet conferences are being held online with significantly reduced fees or even free for those with minimum membership levels. Back in December, SRECon was free, and the next conference is Enigma 2021, the Usenet security-focused conference, and that will be held from February 1st to the 3rd. The standard conference fee now is $125, but sustainer membership itself is $120, and with that, you get access to all the online free conferences. Also coming up is the FAST conference in February and the Network Systems Design and Implementation in April. Those are all going to be free. LISA is currently scheduled for in-person in Anaheim in June, but I imagine that will change if we're all still locked up and will become free too. For those who have been BayLISA members before this week, there was an email that went out. Developer Week is coming up again, And Developer Week 2021 will also be online and free. Well, not free, but they've given us a code to either get a free open access pass or a significantly reduced full pro pass. Dev Week is going to be held February 17th to 19th and is the world's largest developer and engineering conference with tracks covering development leadership, AI/ML learning, API microservices, blockchain security, microservices, and more. Speakers include tech leaders from LinkedIn, Square, Red Hat, and many more. I will post the URL for the discount code in chat, and I believe it's also in a message on the Meetup message board. If anyone else knows of any interesting tech events coming up, please mention it in the chat, and we will unmute you to talk about it. No? Okay, a little harder now than we're in person, but we typically reserve a bit of time for job announcements. We dedicate a few minutes to anyone who's either looking for a job or their company has a job opening. Even in these crazy times, people are still looking for jobs. So if you have an announcement, either you have or you're looking, again, please just say hi in chat, and we will unmute you.
Well, actually, I can chime up here. I've been interviewing for quite some time, and in a several round process, got to a point where I almost got hired today, but they said no. So I'll still be looking. I do all kinds of crazy stuff, from sysadmin stuff to DevOps stuff to CTO level stuff. So if anything is interesting in that space or emerging technologies, I do a lot of work with startups and new groups and companies that bring new technology to life. So that's me. That's Rob. You know how to find me. I'll leave it up to anyone else.
So just to be clear, there's a chat button in the upper right-hand corner of your GoToMeeting. So if you click on that, you can bring up the chat window and you can send a message. So we can, if you have something you want to share. Again, it's also where we're looking for the QA. Yep. Oh, there's a guy telling everybody, here's chat. Okay, well, if you have an event or you have a job still posted there, we'll look again at the end of the meeting and we'll swing back to that. Okay, so for tonight's talk, for many of us, SOX was a shift in how companies were exposed to regulatory compliance. SOX attempted to take what was a wide and varied set of processes, procedures, and corporate financial reports and craft them into a comprehensive corporate financial reporting framework. This was to prevent further accounting scandals that brought down such large companies as Enron, WorldCom, and Arthur Andersen. Before SOX, though, compliance was mostly a big public company problem, but now it was required by law for all public and looking to go public companies. Back then, this became a headache for smaller companies, especially tech companies who were looking to move fast and break things and fund their growth with IPOs. Companies found a way to get it done, but it was messy and time-consuming. As we fast forward to today, besides SOX, many of us are also now familiar with such things as PCI DSS for payment transactions, HIPAA for health data, ISO 27001 for security management, and many more. As businesses have become more and more reliant on computer systems and services, if not had those systems and services become the offered product themselves, compliance in all forms has become ever more intertwined with the workings, monitoring, and reporting on the increased varied systems and services. Combine this with the progressively larger systems trends over the years of platform as a service, at scale, and cloud, and existing techniques may have become insufficient to reliably ensure the timeliness and accuracy of compliance reports. So tonight, we have a talk that will show us how compliance as code might help us tame the system side of the compliance beast. And to walk us through this, please welcome Niamh Cahill of Progress Software with the talk, Compliance as Code, using automation to turn compliance and security into tests.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate that. So first of all, I just want to share with you, I actually have a coaster that is an Arthur Andersen coaster that I picked up in a secondhand store in Portland for 50 cents this year, simply because, or last year rather, simply because I lived through that period, and I lived through that period where socks became the thing because of Enron and Arthur Andersen and all the stuff that went down. And I think that at the end of the day, you know what? I don't care if the bigwigs at Arthur Andersen had a bad day, but I do care about the folks who had the knock-on effect of them not being compliant at the end of the day, which was, basically people who were linemen at Pac Bell, et cetera, ended up having their pensions destroyed, et cetera, because of this lack of compliance. So it does have a real world effect, and I think that compliance is important, even though I don't know about y'all, but when I think about compliance, literally it's an eye-rolling experience a lot of times. It's something you have to do, and I think the key about compliance, the key approach to compliance, is essentially baking it into your process and making it as easy as possible for all your teams to adhere to. And I think that's the key thing to approach. And, so I live in Portland, Oregon, and there's a lot of folks that I talk to in the area here. And if you think about, security at, companies like Nike, for example, it's about enabling those teams to adhere to compliance and security while also pivoting to containers and DevOps and all the other cool stuff that's going on. So it's about how do you enable those teams to move with velocity, but also make sure that they are secure and compliant. And it's not just about vulnerabilities at the end of the day, right? So I think we focus a lot about vulnerabilities, but at the end of the day, it's about all the stuff that goes along for the ride when you deploy a change into your environment. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm very excited. So Mark, I know you mentioned about companies that are hiring. So I just wanted to give a shout out that Chef is hiring. So Chef was acquired by Progress Software, and Progress is a company that has a long history. It's been around for about 40 years at this point, and basically they're really focusing on the DevOps area, and we are hiring across the board. So if you are interested in working for Chef and Progress, please reach out to us. We have a number of opportunities that are open, and I'd love to talk to you all. Cool. So do we want to just dive right into the presentation and the demo and everything?
Yep, you're up.
Excellent. So hopefully screen sharing will go a little bit better than it usually does in these situations. There we go. Excellent.
Looks good.
Cool. So what we're going to talk about tonight is about automating compliance and automating security. And I think we've all talked about or understood, how important it is to patch your vulnerabilities and understand, what your vulnerability and, deployed software stance is in the world. But at the end of the day, I think what we're going to talk about tonight is all the stuff that goes along with that. So when you talk about DevOps, you're talking about an infrastructure as code and an automated approach to deploying applications, infrastructure, cloud instances, VMware instances. It really doesn't matter. You just need to make sure that all the stuff that goes along with that is secure. And that not only it adheres to your compliance standards, but also that it is functional, that what you're deploying works in the way that you want it to. And so that's really why compliance as code matters. And so we've talked, to a certain degree in the industry about infrastructure as code and codifying things like, if you think about VMware templates or Terraform or Packer, what those approaches mean in terms of deploying updates to your applications in your business. But at the end of the day, if the stuff that goes along with that is insecure, that's really a problem. And for your application teams and for your DevOps teams, if you make that really, really easy and really straightforward and baked into the process, that's really a win-win for everybody. Because at the end of the day, I've been the person who is up at 11 o'clock at night trying to figure out why something went wrong or why something, wasn't secure when it got deployed. And at Chef, what we're really about is basically enabling, people who are in operations to deploy securely and also in a reliable manner, and also reduce their risk. And so, that's really what it's all about. So if you're looking at the attendance and, why is her name spelled that way? I do get this a lot, maybe 5 times a day. My name is Neve. It's pronounced Neve, or rhymes with Steve. Gaelic names are difficult. And so in a way, it's a good moniker. It's a good way to remember my name, but it is difficult, and I realize that. So MH is a V sound in Gaelic, and Neve is the way it's pronounced. So if you see me out on LinkedIn, if you see me out in the wild, I appreciate you recognizing the name. And it's not the most difficult Irish name, but I do. There's a really funny Stephen Colbert skit around Irish names, and it's not even a skit. He talks through, how does that spelling result in this pronunciation? And you know what? If you don't speak Gaelic, it's hard to explain. So anyway, I appreciate you all understanding that and remembering how to pronounce it. So just wanted to give you that up front. So in terms of why are we even here? So if you talk about deploying applications and deploying changes into your environment, we have, at length struggled to plug security holes and find compliance failures. And really what we're going to talk about tonight is about shifting that process left. So I was a sysadmin at AIG, and we ran about 186,000 servers. So this is about 12 years ago. It's been a while now, and I'm sure they've pivoted to containers and doing stuff in the cloud. But at the same time, the challenges around compliance and the challenges around security remain the same. And if you think about deploying at scale, whether you're deploying on-prem, quote unquote, or private cloud, right? It's the same challenge as if you're deploying into public cloud. And honestly, ensuring that not only are your infrastructure as code deployments are going to be functional and work, but also be compliant and adherent to things like standards like PCI, SOX. We talked a lot about this. Other standards. That's very important. So it is a delicate balance, and you want to enable your teams to be secure while at the same time allowing them to deploy at speed, right? So I think a lot of the challenges around updating your applications, updating your server instances, your cloud deployments, you need to enable teams to bake that into their own processes. And that's really what Chef Inspec is all about. So the challenge is really, we've all had the person coming to us. I spoke earlier about, the KPMG auditor who's walking in and going, well, you need to fill out this spreadsheet, and this is really, something you have to do right now. And so you pivot away from what you're doing from a day-to-day basis, and you try to fill out the spreadsheet and make sure that you're compliant with your environment. Basically, that's a lot. And it doesn't mean you're necessarily compliant. It just means you're answering the process when the KPMG auditor comes to call, right? And so, if you look at the security highlights here, you have a lot of time that's taken away from what you want to be doing on a day-to-day basis. It says here, we're distracting staff from high-value work, but at the end of the day, it's basically about, I don't really want to be putting out spreadsheets, right? You don't have visibility. So from a fundamental practical perspective, it doesn't mean that you're more secure, essentially. It just means that you are adhering to, the audit process when the auditors come around. And yes, of course, it's better than nothing, but it doesn't enable your company to deliver at speed. So right now, if you think about where we're at in terms of information security, breaches take a really long time to discover. So this is pretty dated at this point, but if you think about Target's security breach, that took a really long time to discover. And it was basically because of traffic anomalies that we discovered that. And not, no ding on Target at all. It just, these kinds of breaches and these kinds of security breaches are very hard to discover. Basically, it's really important to patch against vulnerabilities, and it's really important to patch and address your vulnerabilities very quickly. So how do we bake that into a traditional approach? So our traditional approach is basically it's basically what's on the right. So you're compliant, and then you deploy the things, you deploy the application update, and your compliance dips. And so, you have these peaks and valleys of actual compliance levels. So what would be better is if you had your assumed compliance levels, which are the dotted lines on the left here, which are, you're compliant and you're pretty much adherent to that compliance level on an ongoing basis. But I think we all know that that's not the case. And so what you're doing is you're leaving open windows of risks. And that is really a problem. So the other issue that you have is different teams are speaking different languages, right? So you have the compliance team, and they have their compliance report that they're running, and are you vulnerable? What different deviations do you have from your SOX compliance report, et cetera? You have security, which is a team that's also concerned about compliance, but also obviously concerned about things like vulnerabilities and other trajectories that hackers might use to come into the environment. And then you have the DevOps team who wants to be secure, but also wants to move fast and deliver business value. And of course, all these teams want to deliver business value, of course, but how do you enable them all to work together? And so what Chef Inspect allows you to do is to create a common way of approaching that. And so when you think about infrastructure as code, that's one way of approaching, deploying infrastructure, deploying updates, et cetera, and codifying your environment in terms of Terraform, Chef, Ansible, et cetera. But then what Chef Inspect does is it layers in on top of that, and it ensures that not only is the configuration that you're deploying functional, but also that it's secure, that it's compliant with your standards, that it actually works in the way that you want it to. And that's a really, really cool thing. And in terms of how our customers are deploying this out in their environment, it really dovetails really, really well with solutions like, if you're just talking about VMs or regular infrastructure, it absolutely supports Ansible. Chef Inspect also dovetails really nicely with cloud environments as well as container image creation, and it plugs right into infrastructure as code pipelines as well as deployment pipelines. So how does this work essentially? So when you think about compliance as code, you want something that is legible, and you have auditors who come in and they're not necessarily particularly versed in code or able to understand it. But at the end of the day, if they're in any way technical at all, they should be able to read and inspect control. And this is how we define that. And so if you look at the essential checks and balances that we include in Inspect, we're saying that in this case, SSHD config should be equal to SSHD2. So it's a very straightforward example. And honestly, there's tons of different examples out there around compliance as code where folks and teams and other companies have contributed to InSpec and come up with profiles that check whether or not certain settings are A, functional, and B, compliant. So what that allows you to do is, as you're deploying your infrastructure as code, you can shift left and you can leverage your pipeline to test whatever it is you're deploying. And if you look at this, protocol should be equals to 2. That's a pretty basic example, but there's tons of other examples that we can check. And essentially, what we do is we define standards, and then if you want, and what we can do within Chef InSpec is make those hierarchical. So what that means is you might have different standards for your dev environment compared to your production environment, right? That's kind of pretty, par for the course. And at the end of the day, if you want to have those different standards, what Chef InSpec does is allows you to codify those standards and take that continuous deployment and pipeline approach to those standards. So as you're deploying using a deployment pipeline, you can bake an InSpec check into that deployment pipeline and have it as part of your checks and balances. So basically, if you're deploying an update to your application and you want to check, for one last time that, certain things like, gosh, I don't know, HTTPS is turned on. It's a very basic example. Oh, and TLS 1.2 is also turned on. You can have that as a check in your pipeline. InSpec is really built into this approach that we don't care how you're deploying. You can run InSpec as an InSpec exec command against your deployment pipelines. We're checking to make sure that your deployment is functional and that it's compliant. So are there any questions around any of that?
I actually have one. I'm unfamiliar with the product. I'm more familiar with CF Engine and Puppet as far as configuration management is concerned. So from my point of view, it would be more, I see this more of a, if you want SSHD, for example, only to use version 2 of the protocol, you would just set that, period. And then you don't need to actually look at it, check later, because it's part of your configuration and it is. How does InSpec actually fit? And Chef can do that too, right? So how does InSpec fit with, say, Chef configuration management? Is it complementary or is it kind of a replacement?
So that's a great question. So thank you for asking. It's complementary. And here's how that works. InSpec doesn't care how you're configuring the thing. It just ensures that it's configured correctly, right? So if you think about it in that context, we have these out-of-the-box profiles with InSpec that essentially check things like what you mentioned in terms of, so in this case, SSHD config, but I have some other examples that I'm going to share around, infrastructure as code and DevOps deployments. And what it does is it plugs right into Ansible or Puppet or Chef configurations and ensures that they're compliant. The other thing that InSpec does is after you've deployed, so we're going to assume that things are immutable at this point, right? So immutable means in theory they shouldn't change, but that is a concept that's associated with an individual container, right? And so you have all these things that go along with it for the ride. And what InSpec does is on an ongoing basis, it can scan remotely to make sure that nobody has actually changed that configuration. And when I say nobody, I mean, maybe some other mechanism has come in and changed that config. Maybe somebody has manually updated that. And what we like to talk about at Chef is essentially one path to production. So from our point of view, it doesn't matter whether it's Chef or Ansible or Puppet, right? But you need to make sure that how you're configuring your deployments is not prone to being hacked or updated by other people. Does that answer your question, Rob?
Yeah, I think good enough.
Or Guy,
I
sorry.
think
I'm
that's
sorry.
okay. 3-letter words, you know. I'll just kind of, if I want more clarity, need more clarity, I'll ask again after your demo. I think I want to see it in action a little bit, and that will kind of help me.
Yeah, and I also have a great set of, you know, blogs and articles that have been written about InSpec and how it works and functions as a whole. So in theory, yes, you would have one path to production. Nobody would ever change that stuff. But I think in reality, things get updated and that's not ideal. And what InSpec does is it can run on an ongoing basis and detect that. It can also be baked in as part of your pipeline. So, you know, not that necessarily people are going to hack your pipeline, but if you want to ensure certain standards within your configuration for your pipeline, we can be baked into that. Does that make sense? So you do InSpec exec as part of your pipeline, and it runs against a container image or a server image or whatever it is that you want to deploy.
Gotcha. Yep, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, it's really flexible. I mean, I really like it from the point of view of, you know, it can check configurations for stuff at the container or the, you know, server level, but it can also check configurations for, you know, around applications and making sure, just stupid stuff like, is my S3 bucket configured to be public, right? So the flexibility around InSpec is the fact that it can be called as a command from a pipeline or on your server itself or within your cloud environment and check, quote unquote, the thing, right? Whatever it is you want to check. So it's super scalable, and then it can report back your results to, think about it as inputs and outputs. It can report back your results to whatever it is you want to report back to. Cool, so we talked about that. So this is essentially the continuous compliance workflow. It's a similar approach to, you know, continuous deployment within applications or infrastructure. And then it's about, you know, implementing not only your configuration. So obviously Chef Infra is the Chef approach to this world, but there's other ways to do this, right? And honestly, you know, within Chef itself, we use a lot of, you know, VMware, Terraform, depending on the cloud environment. And then we layer InSpec on top of that. And then observability is where Chef Automate sits at, and that gives you visibility into what your configuration is across the board. So in terms of, you know, what Chef InSpec means and what it does is it really takes the CIS compliance standards and it translates them into code. And, you know, this is an example that leverages PCI, but honestly, once you're CIS compliant at level 1, you adhere to a number of different standards, including SOX, PCI, HIPAA, GDPR, etc. And so when you're deploying applications or when you're deploying to the cloud or on-prem, what it does is it does really pragmatic, functional tests around, is this the configuration that I want to deploy? Does it work? And also, is it secure? And what Chef does in terms of Chef InSpec is we have a codified library of application configurations and operating system, you know, OS controls, etc., that allow you to check that, for example, even if you're doing it in containers, is my container secure? So what that means from a practical point of view is, you know, did somebody who developed this container, did they download it from online? Because you can tell that from the container configuration. Does my container work? Is my container running as root or is it not? Do I have monitoring configured for my container? All these kinds of things. Do I have App Armor configured? And so not only does it do these checks and balances, but the checks are pretty legible from an IT audit perspective. So if you do have those audit teams coming in to run reports, et cetera, on your environment, what's really cool about this is you can hand them this process that says, hey, this is how I'm checking to make sure I'm compliant. But if I want to change my standards for a particular team or for a particular environment, this is the approach that I take. And when we talk about CI/CD around compliance as code, that's what that means. It means that I can have different standards for my dev environment, for my production environment, for my customer-facing environment. Maybe I need to apply PCI controls to a specific set of deployments. It really doesn't matter. It's extremely flexible from that perspective. It can be hierarchical. So what that means is you can have a baseline config that you want to check for everything. And then you can take that configuration and refine it for specific environments and for specific teams. So obviously your dev environment is not going to be as stringent as your production environment. And that's completely fine. And so I think a lot of the time what happens is we're not enabling teams to check their security on their dev systems because they need to have certain capabilities, but then when you deploy to production, it's a whole different set of standards. So what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of the demo, and I realize that we're coming to the top of the hour here, is this approach that Chef uses. And honestly, you could use this in a number of different technologies, but honestly, we take the approach of detect, correct, automate. So the first step is detect, which is baselining your environments and making sure that, what's my configuration? No matter whether you're deploying across containers, Kubernetes, EC2 instances, in Azure, is what I'm deploying secure and is what I'm deploying functional, right? So from that perspective, I think it's really cool that Inspect can allow you to spin up a container, do a security scan on it, and make sure that it actually works and is also adherent to your compliance standards. So I'm going to pause there for a second and just ask, does anybody have any questions around that? So I see somebody talking, but you're muted, I think.
I don't think we have anybody asking questions.
Oh, okay. I saw somebody that looked muted, Mark. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Cool. Cool. So, I mean, honestly, if you think about, how we're talking about compliance, and I see a couple of questions in the chat there, so I will address those. At the end of the day, Stefan, so I'd be really interested to hear the other solutions that you looked at and how they fit into your overall approach. For sure, look, I'm not going to say that Inspect is the be all and end all, but at the end of the day, it's super pragmatic, it's easy to use. In terms of not being there yet with your automation, what I really like about Inspect, and I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second so I can show you how Inspect fits into other frameworks and solutions other than like quote unquote Chef. I'll be completely honest. I worked as a sysadmin at AIG. I ran 186,000 servers. Honestly, we used, scripts and we coded our own CMDB. I moved on to a project with Verizon Wireless subsequently, and we had a vast number of servers there as well. And that was a lot of Perl and shell scripts and, basically keying off of server name for a lot of different things. And what I think is really cool about Inspect is at the end of the day, you need to be scalable. It needs to be easy, and there needs to be not a huge high barrier of entry, right? And I think that's the key is with Inspect, there's tons of open source capabilities out there around InSpec, and I'm going to share those with you in 1 second. But InSpec is there to enable all of us out in the field and make sure that the configurations that we've deployed can be easily baked into other config solutions, not just Chef. So Ansible, Puppet, SCCM. Honestly, InSpec doesn't care. It's checking a config and wants to make sure that it's out there. And yeah, just give me 1 sec, and I am going to share a slightly different screen here. Thank you for your patience. Cool. So here we go. So the folks who created InSpec, like I said, they worked at T-Mobile, and they created InSpec because they were sick of the auditors coming to them going, hey, can you please, give us a report around this specific standard? And so there is an InSpec open source repo. It's the DevSec hardening framework. And if you look at this, it's really cool. There's tons of different stuff in here. What I want to highlight here is features like CIS Docker benchmark, right? So this is also something that Chef delivers as part of our capabilities, but at the end of the day, it is open source. I think one of the strengths of open source is we have a ton of different teams contributing to it. And if you look at the benchmark here, this is what codified compliance as code means. And so what we're checking is, I don't want my user to be root. I don't want, and honestly, just expand this a little bit. Use trusted base images for containers. It sounds really straightforward. It sounds pretty pedantic, but honestly, if you have developers who are downloading images online and they're using those to develop, even if it's just straightforward Alpine, that's a problem, right? Because you don't know where that image is coming from. And so what this allows you to do is say, hey, I want to make sure that my developers are using base images that are part of what I think is okay. And you can put in different checks and balances in here. There's tons of different things you can do around this. And because we have this capability of having everybody contribute and having iterations and having the ability to say, okay, for a development team, this is fine in terms of Docker images, but also, from an overall production perspective, we don't want a Docker image that's out there running as root or not having monitoring turned on or whatever it is you want to have in terms of checks and balances. In terms of, input and how to approach this, there's a ton of different blogs. This is a really cool one. I honestly do not know this blog writer, but in my kind of travels and taking a look online, this is a really great approach. So if you think about how you're deploying applications and this person is obviously deploying into AWS, how do you make sure that that's done in a secure manner? And if we look at it, move down through, they're using Terraform, which I use every day. I don't know about everybody here, but you can replace Terraform with VMware, for example. And if you go down, how do you ensure that what you're deploying as code is actually secure? And this person is using Terraform along with Ansible, but then they're also using Chef InSpec on top of that. And so what they're doing is down here is basically testing to make sure that your application is functional, that your deployments work, and that they're also secure. So it's very, very cool from that perspective. There's a ton of capabilities available online, in addition to what we obviously provide as a company. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot to a quick demo, because I know that we're running out of time here. And what I'm going to leave you with is this idea that DevSecOps can be a unified language. And when you look at the likes of InSpec, that really does a good job of codifying that. If you want to update your standards, you have this capability of committing to your GitHub repo. whatever versioning system you want to use. You can put those compliance standards through a pipeline to make sure that they actually work. There is an awesome project out there called Kitchen CI. Now, Chef sponsors this project. It's completely open source. We do not own it. But what it allows you to do is to take your deployments and test them within certain frameworks along with InSpec. And it's completely automated. It's in YAML files, as you can see. And if you want to learn more about this, just let me know. You can look at the docs here, or you can look on GitHub. There's a lot of capabilities out there. And as you can see, obviously it integrates with Chef, but also integrates with Puppet, integrates with Ansible, CloudFormation, etc. And basically what Kitchen CI does is it plugs in and creates a pipeline for your infrastructure as code. So that approach that you take to application deployments, you can also take to your infrastructure, right? Which is really, really cool. Oh, so
I just want to add
yes.
a comment. Don't feel pressured for time. Remember, we started late, so you're fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. And yes, I just want to share with everybody, I will share the deck that I showed tonight, along with all the links and all the cool stuff that, frankly, I use online every day, and we have a great and active community. Kitchen CI is particularly awesome. So what it is when you run a Kitchen Create, I don't think that this web page really does it justice, but when you run Test Kitchen, what this does is, as a pipeline, it will go out, it will provision whatever it is you want to provision. So you can see up here, you have Azure, AWS, Docker. Kitchen CI really does not care. And when you run a Kitchen Create, it will provision your virtual stuff, quote unquote. So like I said, it could be container, it could be Kubernetes. And then when you run a Kitchen Converge, it will actually validate that what you've deployed as part of your infrastructure as code actually works and that it's secure. So that's really cool. And the awesome folks over at DevSecOps GitHub, that I shared over here, they contribute constantly. They have a ton of stuff in here that you can leverage. So you have Ansible hardening. We also have Chef hardening, Puppet hardening. You have CIS benchmarks around Docker, Kubernetes. And the way that InSpec works in this context is, think about it this way, right? So you have an approach around how do you access your configuration information. So if I've deployed an application in Kubernetes, I need to query Kubernetes to make sure that that's deployed correctly. And then I need to return those results and update my pipeline. And so what InSpec does is, not only does it allow you to query different deployments across lots of different platforms in a very sensible way, but also allows you to take those outputs and parse them. So, what I'm going to show in a second is Chef's output and our reporting structure around that, but just understand that you can actually send those compliance as code tests to HTML, you can send them to JSON, you can send them to Chef's reporting platform. There's a lot of different things you can do with those outputs. So give me one sec here. And we will pivot to our demo. So I hope everybody's having a great evening. Cool.
You got a nice talk, so yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I feel like I've been talking since 7 a.m. this morning, so it's been a day. Cool. Let me just make that a little bit bigger. So think about this this interface as the outputs that you get from Chef InSpec. So you've defined what you want as an application standard or an infrastructure standard, and then it's reported back into this UI. I'm using a UI so you don't have to go into the command line and parse all this data visually. in the command line on a demo. But you can actually do that as well. So if you wanted to use Chef Inspec as part of your pipeline, if you want to use it in an open source way, that's completely fine too. Just understand that, this is the easiest way for me to show what our outputs from Inspec is. So Chef Automate is actually an Elastic search-based front end. It shows you what your compliance basis is over a period of time. So if you look at this, what we've done is we've defined what our standards are for compliance, and we're checking on an ongoing basis. So those checks can be once a day, they can be once a month, however often you want to run them. And they can be part of your pipeline. They could be part of a remote scan that you run. They could be part of something that you run locally on your server itself. So it really depends on how you're deploying change into your environment. So for example, if you think about the scenario with containers, you want to make sure, typically you're not supposed to change containers once they're deployed. So if you're validating that your configuration for your container is secure, you would want to be doing that in your pipeline. But that same result can report back into this UI, and you can have visibility into it. So, what we've had here is you're seeing over the course of the last 10 days, obviously I deployed a bunch of nodes tonight in order for our demo to run. You can group those by platform, OS, you can group those by environment, depending on what your requirements are. And then if you look in here, you'll see nodes, but honestly, if you were running this against a cloud environment, you would see your cloud targets, so S3 buckets, etc. It just really depends on what you're running a scan against. So in this scenario, I have 3 Windows machines and I have 3 Linux machines. And given the fact that obviously we're all part of this group that is BayLISA, this platform and this approach can scan to a very large number of scans and targets and nodes. So we have customers who are scanning up to 10 to 12 million targets per day with this solution. So it's pretty scalable from that perspective. So if we look at what the heck did fail on our Linux scan, you'll see we have 26 pass controls and 27 fail controls. And honestly, if you look at for example, login.defs, you'll see in here we have a ton that were passed, but then you have certain checks that were not passed. And so the password max days is expected to be equal to 60, so 60 days, obviously. And so it's set to basically 100,000 days. And what we're doing here is we're checking to make sure that it's set to 60, it failed, and so that's reported back to our interface. And if you look at the source code for this, what we're doing here is you can see directly in the UI, and this is super helpful if you have an IT auditor coming in and checking these things. You can say, look, you know what, my login time, I've set the standard to be 60 and this particular machine failed. We also have the ability to apply waivers. So for example, if you had a certain machine or a certain environment that needed a waiver for a couple of months, you could apply that in here and you can have it not fail the control. But overall, what you could also do is you could put a check in here that says, yes, this failed, but this is why within this particular environment, right? So you have traceability, you have version control around, what you're seeing in terms of compliance. What's really cool is the skip controls. So what you can do also is say, hey, only check this particular parameter if this condition evaluates to true. So what we're saying here is, this is kind of complicated. What we're saying is basically, hey, we're not running containers, and so we're not going to run these extra checks. A more basic example of that would be if you were running a specific version of Red Hat or SUSE Linux, whatever it might be. You could say, hey, if I'm running this particular version of Linux, then check these things, otherwise check this other stuff. And what's really cool about Inspec is we deliver all these profiles that you have as a starting point to your compliance scans, and you can bake those directly into your pipeline and your controls. So if you go back really quickly to, for example, your Windows machines, which are typically more of a problem, if you look here, we'll see, hey, I'm expecting my password history to be more 24 more passwords, right? So here we go, I got 0, which means it's really not set, right? And then if you go into source, you'll see that we've set this password history size should be greater than or equal to 24. So the goal here is not that somebody's not going to be technical, but that it should be really readable in terms of compliance as code. So there's tons of different checks. And then if you think about this from a practical point of view and your deployments, you can actually use these checks to validate configurations around functional checks. So did my website actually deploy? Did it come up on HTTPS? Does it have the right SSL certs? There's lots of different things that you can do around this. And in terms of profiles to check this, we have a lot of profiles that are available out of the box. There's a ton of profiles that are available as open source. So if you look at this, we have all the different checks that you might want to do around AWS, Apache, Apple OS X. You know, we have a lot of customers who are using this to make sure that their benchmark for their Mac OS deployments are correct. You know, if you look at Windows, one of the really interesting things that I've come across is the fact that we have a differentiation between domain controller and member server. The reason being, if you check a domain controller and you're querying certain parameters around user accounts, that query is obviously going to be different for a domain controller than it is for a member server. And so we want to account for that and make sure that we, you know, have railguards around that and it doesn't query too many things. So as the CIS benchmarks are updated, we update our profiles and we deliver them through this mechanism, and we also deliver them online. We also have DISA-STIG and DevSecOps baseline definitions in here as well. So this relates back to that open source repo that I showed you all earlier. So it's similar to that. And you know, we all obviously all work together on this and contribute. And then this is the DISA-STIG definition for Windows servers. So if that's something that you require, that's something you can leverage around this as well. And in order to leverage these, it's super straightforward. So say you don't care about the UI, you want to do everything through a command line. What you can do is you can run inspec exec and just pass it the URL for this particular server, or you can also pass it the URL for a GitHub repo or your own internal Artifactory. Okay. So yes, Mark, you absolutely can put those controls under revision control. So it's very much the same approach as, you know, infrastructure as code in general, or, you know, development. So you can put that into a pipeline, and what you could do is you have a pipeline either pass certain checks and balances from a security perspective, or you can funnel a pipeline to have a manual approval by a person who has to take a look at what exactly is being deployed. So, cool. And Rob, yes, I absolutely will post all these links into the chat. And look, if anybody wants to chat about how all of this applies to their environment, or how you can practically get your arms around you know, approaching this, that's a lot of what we chat to customers about. So from a chef perspective, look, I'm not going to go in and talk to you about chef specifically, but at the end of the day, you know, we all have certain problems to solve, and you know, helping you get your arms around how to approach that and how to address certain issues in a way that is sustainable and doesn't keep you up on a Friday evening, I think is really important. We have tons of really, you know, open source workshops that we do at Chef around this. So we're more than happy to come in and do a compliance workshop or compliance code workshop and help everybody understand, you know, how this works and how this rolls out.
Thanks, Neve. I have a question for
Yeah. Yeah,
you. This is only a reporting UI, right? So you can't do any
correct.
edits and updates.
So,
Is
yes,
there
yes,
a
but
tool
actually
that
no.
can scan a sort of golden machine image and give you a base spec from that, which then you can kind of
Absolutely.
modify?
Yeah, so the way that works is what we typically do is you store your, so first of all, you can't edit the standards directly in the UI here, but what you can do is you can actually go in and you can download a benchmark, edit it, and then re-upload it to this platform. Or you can put it into GitHub, or you can put it in Artifactory or a file server somewhere. We really don't mind. The way you would leverage that with a golden image pipeline is you would build your golden image and you would call the inspect profile as part of that process. That sounds complicated, but it's really not. You just call inspect exec and you give it a URL or a file path, and it will call these exact checks that you've defined here. So if you give me 1 second, I will actually bring up that architecture diagram for you, because that's something that I think it's really cool, because honestly, I've had to define images. It's a lot. And having that baked into the process, I think really just kind of, if you're talking about shifting left, I think that's really super helpful. Give me 1 sec here.
So just to clarify, what you're going to show us is a process that can generate a new benchmark from a golden image.
Exactly. Yeah. So not a demo, it's an architectural overview, to be quite honest. So
Sure.
cool. And again, I'm happy to share this with anybody who's on here. I find this really cool. When I first started as Chef, I was like, whoa, this is awesome. So essentially what this does, so we're talking about Packer here, but just understand that honestly, we don't care whether it's Packer or Kimu or Citrix or VMware that's defining your image. What you're doing is you're essentially defining, hey, this is what I want to have as my compliance standard. And in this particular example, we're creating an image within Packer. What's really cool about Packer, and to be quite honest, HashiCorp, this is an open source project that they have. It allows you to take a source image and build upon it, which I don't know about y'all, but that's what I typically do. Is I take a standard image and then I'm going to build upon that. And what this does is it takes that as code and then it implements a configuration on top of that. And so in this case, obviously I'm using Chef Infra, but you can define whatever standards you want to through Chef Inspec, run it through your pipeline, and then build your new image that way. And if your compliance checks fail for whatever reason, you could go back in and update your configuration, update your compliance check, whatever it is you want to do, and then create a new image from there.
So this works on both OS images and app images?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Yep. It's pretty cool. I mean, I think this is, when I speak to customers and folks who are out there trying to get out the door with infrastructure as code or compliance as code, honestly, this is where I would start. Because I think a lot of companies are out there that are defining images. You have to define that, deploy those across the board. And assuming, certain companies have immutable infrastructure and they're defining everything in that image, this is a really great approach. I think it's really good, and it's very sustainable, it's very scalable, and obviously this is the ultimate shifting left in terms of operating system.
Yeah, totally. They've already spent a lot of time getting to a certain point, and now they need this feedback loop. And spending another month writing it from scratch would be pretty painful.
Exactly. Well, I'll give you an example, right? I have a customer here in Portland who they're completely Windows shop, right? And they're Citrix, and it's our local hospital system. So obviously very near and dear to my heart, especially at this point. And I want to support them. And what they're trying to do was essentially do compliance as code around Citrix and healthcare applications. So that's a tough thing to solve. And so the team that we were working with, they were essentially given a Citrix image. It's a base image. We're like, we don't know even where to start with this. We want to make sure that we codify it. We've been given this charter by our leadership team that we have to have compliance as code and help basically. And what we did was we came in and we created an inspect profile that essentially checked what they needed on that image. And they didn't even do it in a pipeline. They ran it manually, but what they were doing was basically validating the configurations that were built into that image. And so what we ended up doing was a chef cookbook to configure the image. And then we ran a chef inspect profile to validate the configuration of that image and make sure that, yes, this is totally good to go. We can flip the switch and deploy this into our Citrix environment. Because what would happen before was they were doing a lot of steps manually, and they were, we all can miss steps that way. I mean, I know I have, right? And so, if they missed a step and that image got deployed, it was really a lot of effort to pull that back and update everything again. So, even though they were just going in and running the chef cook manually and running chef inspect, manually after that, it really worked pretty well for them because they were going against this one image and making sure that it ran properly.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah, no problem. Cool. So, I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think that Inspect's really cool. I think codifying configuration checks is honestly a very scalable way to approach this kind of issue. If any of you have any issues or any questions after this, please reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions and work with you all. And again, if you Google this, you'll come up with a ton of chef inspect resources and how-to articles around whatever the issue is that you're trying to solve, to be quite honest. So, happy to talk to you all tonight, and I'm really happy to do this demo.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I do kind of have one more question.
Sure.
That is kind of along the lines of what I was talking about before. As a compliance officer, I totally would love to be able to use this to be able to say, run a spec benchmark against some randomly selected host or set of hosts that the auditor says, hey, I want to see one of these, one of those, one of that, and have it, just pull back a report that says, yep, just a bunch of green check marks. That would be great. And then, the occasional red X or yellow dot, whatever. But maybe tied into, rather than having to write a set or import a set of benchmarks that are developed separately from my configuration standard, it would be awesome if it could pull up from my configuration standard, if it could go and measure against that, right? And nominally, my configuration standard would be tied to STIG or whatever, particular set of measures and settings that I want to have. How How close to doable do you think something like that is?
I think we're 80% of the way there. And I'm being completely honest with that. So we don't have the complete virtuous cycle for all of that. But I think with the inspect profiles that Chef has out of the box, you get 80% of the way there. And then you need to update those to adhere to your own environment. And the other challenge is if you update your configurations or your configuration standards, typically what we recommend is that you have your inspect standards go along for the ride, so they're part of that process. So again, if you're baking that in, I think it makes a lot of sense. If you're trying to do it after the fact as a manual configuration, it becomes a lot. So that is challenging, but I think with the out-of-the-box profiles, you do get a lot of the way there. And again, I mean, honestly, there is, if you look at that DevSec repo that I showed on GitHub, there's a ton of standard configs out there that I think will also get you there, but they're not inherently and automatically tied hand in hand, unfortunately. I would love, right? But I think the only way to do that is to basically bake it into your image and have it completely shift left.
Yeah, which essentially is the direction that LinkedIn has been moving recently. It's cool, but it's really hard to get there.
It is hard to get there. I think that you know, if you check out the open source inspect profile. So by the way, I know that the Azure Kubernetes team and the Azure team in general, I think still uses inspect within Microsoft for what it's worth. So you can chat to those folks, but I know that they're still running those standards. And what they're doing is essentially, if they have a config update they need to do, then they make sure that gets reflected in inspect. So to your point, it's not 100%, you know, a virtuous cycle, but we're getting there. And we're trying to make that as systematic as possible, to be quite honest. And you know, as CIS benchmarks get updated, we update the recommendations and the profiles. And yeah, there's certain CIS recommendations that are like, you know, don't allow physical access to your data center. So we're not going to check that, but all the other stuff we can definitely check, and we bake that into those profiles.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Do you ever find the need to scan a couple of systems, generate profiles, and then diff them?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's totally something you can do. You can just run a profile locally or against a specific system and just say, hey, you know what, I'm good to go. And that's actually the use case for pipelines, to be quite honest. So if you're looking at a golden image or a container image, you're going to do that on a one-off basis and say, yep, you know what, it's good to go. You know, let's go on our merry way, and we continue on our pipeline.
Yeah, it sounds interesting from a deployment scenario into various different environments. Like there's a build, and then in the tests environment, it gets deployed one way with all those credentials and controls, and then in production, it gets deployed slightly differently. But you need to double check that it's very close to the spec.
Exactly. And the way you trigger an inspect profile or that scan and that check, you can do it on an ongoing basis from a central location, and you can do it remotely. The way we do that is inspect has this concept of inspect trains. So you can say, hey, you know, check this through the Docker API, or check this through, you know, AWS or Azure, or check it through SSH or WinRM. And then here are the things I need you to check on that particular deployment. So from that perspective, that's what means it basically, you can decouple that need to run locally from the actual inspect check. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that might be something that's useful for a guy as well. If he needs to do these one-off checks for compliance, he's got tens of thousands of servers, and you just pick a few statistically, and there you go.
So you can do that. I mean, honestly, with the approach we take with inspect, you could do that, or what I would typically typically recommend is if you have tens of thousands of servers, bake that into your image process and then make them immutable, although that's not ideal for everybody, right? Or you could have scans that you run however often. Our scans can run locally on the servers itself. So you can do an inspect exec on your local machine, whether it's Windows or Linux, and then report the results back to HTML, JSON, whatever it is you want to report to, or you can do them remotely. So it just depends on your requirements, to be quite honest.
What's the language it's written in and requirements to run it?
So InSpec is an offshoot of Ruby. It's an offshoot of RSpec, as it's an evolution of that. There's a really good blog out there that explains exactly what it is and how you leverage it, and I will share that with everybody. But at the bottom line is it is Ruby, but it's very scalable. When I think of Ruby, I think of like, gosh, it's not really very scalable, et cetera, et cetera. It takes a long time to run, but that's really truly not the case with InSpec. I have customers who are, you know, as I said, scanning 12 million targets a day with InSpec. So it's very, very scalable from that perspective. RSpec started as a system checking solution for basic infrastructure as code, and then InSpec evolved from that.
So is InSpec required on all the machines, or is it all a remote check?
It can be either or, whatever suits your architecture. So it can be 100% remote. So if you wanted to do 100% SSH / WinRM, you could do that. If you prefer to run locally, you can do that too.
Yep. For large deployments, people don't usually like to install extra stacks for running stuff locally.
Depends, right? So if you're doing 40,000, 100,000 servers, doing SSH or WinRM to each of those, it depends on your architecture, right? So you can do those in groups by location. That's totally fine. Sometimes we do have, end users that we work with who want to have it run locally, which is fine too. And then again, with like container images, you're going to do that in your container pipeline and essentially ensure if you have an immutable container image, you're going to shift that check left, you scan your image once, and then hopefully you deploy and nobody ever changes anything, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Eben made some good points about API checks and agentless checking. So.
Yeah, totally true. So one of the things, and this is true for Chef as a whole, our key focus for this coming year is making sure that obviously the cloud APIs, they're evolving constantly. So making sure that, to your point, we can scale from a remote perspective and make sure that we support that architecturally, but also that we're querying the right things in the right way, that it's optimized. And so that's something we do today, but we're going to continue to really partner with Azure and AWS and GCP.
Do you know of any efforts to port InSpec or rewrite it in something less Ruby?
So no, but honestly, so I'll be completely blunt. With Chef clients, there are efforts underway to rewrite that in, part of it's already being rewritten in Erlang and also Go and also Rust. Yep. So it just really depends. With InSpec, we really haven't had scalability challenges to quite the level that you see with Chef clients. So it actually hasn't been a gap. So now, I'm not a product manager, so it is entirely possible that that's something that's on our roadmap for this coming year in order to get us to where we need to go with cloud. But so far as I can tell, I think that's not a huge gaping need. But obviously, if that's something that architecturally becomes something that we need, we're totally going to do that. And obviously, we're also open to suggestions and conversations around that as well.
Yeah, it's not usually anything against Ruby, but more about keeping the code infrastructure in the same language for other reasons.
Totally. No, I wholeheartedly agree. So Rob, what language would you optimally see this written in?
Oh, I don't have a preference. It's just a pattern that I've come across.
Gotcha. Okay. No, I agree for sure.
CSH, please.
So Inspect can actually shell out if you wanted to, but I wouldn't recommend it, to be honest. One of the powers of it is that it actually abstracts away from the shell. So
That was a very tickling comment, Guy.
Yeah, I was not at all being serious.
okay.
CSH is ancient.
If you want to
And
rewrite
slow.
everything in CSH, you can.
Yeah,
We're
no,
open
thank
source.
you.
You can contribute.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Eben has said. Is you really don't need to know. Look, I don't know how to code Ruby. I've been coding for years. I don't know how to code Ruby, and I've never needed to know how to code Ruby in order to deploy Inspect, to be quite honest. So it's pretty powerful from that perspective. You can go into base Ruby, but we don't recommend it. One of the aspects of Inspect that's really powerful is the fact that, you know, all those checks I showed where we're saying, hey, check that it's HTTPS, we're abstracting away from all of the underlying operating system or container or application components. I think it's really cool.
Awesome. Any other questions from the people on the line? Feel free to unmute and join us.
Looks
Well,
like
maybe it
we
was
exhausted
Dias.
everyone.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate everybody's time and your attention. It's been a good session. Thanks for listening to me in my demo.
Oh,
It was a pleasure.
thank you, Neve, for presenting. It was a really great talk. I do hope everyone enjoyed it as much as.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, yep. There we go. Everybody saying thank you. For those attending, we are interested in your thoughts and comments, suggestions about how the event went. Drop us a line email. Tell us what you think. We're still working on next month's meeting, so keep an eye out for details on the meetup.com site. And yep, thank Neve, and thank you all for showing up. And we'll see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Good night. Take care, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye. See you later.
Good night.
Copy.
Ooh, record the chat. Whoa. Just FYI, Mark, I'd stopped the recording.
Oh, now?
After everybody